Hey everybody, today we are going to be doing a topic video. We're talking about most overrated directors and why. This is a bit of a controversial topic. Some people really enjoy talking about it and getting to all the juicy stuff. Other people see it, understandably, as, easy clickbait and dismissive of certain directors. There is a bit of truth to that for sure. But I mean, I've never really been in the business of just like bashing people for the sake of bashing people. The reason I do topics like this is because I kind of think it's interesting to open up the discussion. I think people are entitled to their own opinions for sure, but I also just think it's interesting when somebody, talks about a director that they really don't like and they're really good at describing it, and it might be somebody that I love, and it forces me to kind of think about why I like them. And so, I think that's a good thing. But yes, the intent here is not to kind of reduce directors down to something. It is, more to kind of talk about them. So we'll start with the first one. First is McDonough. I'm guessing you mean Martin McDonough. I love In Bruges, and I think it's still his best. But in each of his subsequent films, I found a lack of tonal control that exposes his weaknesses in writing and directing. He creates great premises, which, in my opinion, lead mostly to great individual scenes and performances, not fully coming together as a whole at the end of those films. Still intrigued in revisiting Banshees, though. Yeah, I totally agree with you, and that's something that I have said multiple times, and I know a lot of people disagree with me. I loved In Bruges initially when I saw it, because I was 18 years old, and I think that's a perfect movie to watch at that time. But as I got older, I agree with you. I think there is something. I know he's a playwright for sure, but there is something about his work that does feel just a little bit caricature, a little bit forced. There is something about his that feels overtly conscious, and what you say, I think In Bruges, the story to it is fantastic. And, when I saw Banshees of Inisherin, I went back and watched lots of scenes from In Bruges, which I hadn't seen in a long time. And they're very funny. I mean, there's so many funny scenes. But at the same time, when I watch it all together, it's like, it could be a masterpiece, but it's like, it's really lacking something because it feels kind of a little bit like second-rate Tarantino. It has that Guy Ritchie kind of thing where we're going for all the quirks, the eccentricities, but we're also like, creating all of this like tragedy at the same time. And there's something mystical to McDonough films as well. I thought Banshees of Inisherin was his most mature film that I've seen. Certainly was a lot better than Three Billboards of Ebbing, Missouri, which I did not care for. And yeah, In Bruges and Banshees both are perfect companion pieces for sure. And they really reflect the weight of time. This might be blasphemous, but PTA. While I think There Will Be Blood is a perfect movie, nothing else I've seen from him has really managed to hit that level. Maybe I'm just not really a big fan of his style. I can respect his films, but don't particularly like them. Okay, I'm glad you say that. I do like Paul Thomas Anderson, but what you are saying does make sense to me, or I can relate to it to a degree. I think Paul Thomas Anderson is a master filmmaker, and whether you love him or you hate him, you can at least appreciate just how much detail goes into his movies, just the aesthetic. I mean, his movies really transport you. It's like the actors are stepping out of the eras in which the movie's taking place in, for real. And all of that, I think, is amazing. And you just don't get that very often, even in some of the great filmmakers. And yes, There Will Be Blood, I absolutely agree with you. It is his best film by far. And nothing else has ever really come close. A lot of his movies are amazing and have amazing things in them, and yet none of them, for me, feel even remotely close to There Will Be Blood in terms of achievement. But that said, I haven't seen The Master in a really long time, and I found many things about that interesting, but other things about it a little bit perplexing. I thought Phantom Thread was fantastic, and I admit I haven't seen that since I reviewed it, so I've only seen it one time, but it's something that always sticks in my mind as something that's like, that was a very interesting, very kind of off-kilter love story with, strange humor in it, and I would like to return to that. So I can see that growing with multiple viewings. But yeah, I have to totally agree with you. When I mention films that I really, really love, just my personal favorite movies, There Will Be Blood almost always gets mentioned, and none of his other movies do get mentioned. Even movies like Punch Drunk Love, a fantastic movie, a movie that I recommend to so many people, and yet I don't think I love it quite as much as everybody else does. I don't think it moves me quite to the degree that it moves other people. I was always like, oh, like we're really, really, really close. What else you got? And then came There Will Be Blood, and it's like, okay, you just answered all my questions. Thank you. I will say, I think it's actually kind of interesting. I've noticed a lot of directors kind of using Paul Thomas Anderson influence, but it actually is coming more from earlier in his career. I'm noticing a lot of people borrowing from like Boogie Nights. I just saw Babylon second time actually I saw Babylon. And it's like, yeah, they're borrowing way too much from a movie like Boogie Nights, and I'm noticing a lot of references to like the editing and in Magnolia, like the season 1 of Euphoria. I think it's like episode 5. That episode is very similar and really masterfully pulls off that whole style. Paul, really did establish his style much more later on, especially with Punch Drunk Love. You start to see it kind of solidifying. And I always saw movies like that, like Boogie Nights and Magnolia, as more like, he hasn't quite found his style. He's borrowing a lot more from Altman and Scorsese. I mean, they're really pronounced pieces and they're amazing, but it's like, he still has his foot kind of in another world, and he needs to become more an individual. Licorice Pizza just reminded me of like an amazing nonfiction novel or something written in the 1970s, and everything was so, I wasn't born in the 70s, I didn't live during that time, and yet it just felt so palpable to me. And yet the story of it is a little bit strange, and it's hard for me to get on board with that at the same time. So yeah, there is just kind of a muddled thing with Paul Thomas Anderson. I get it. Wes Anderson, his early works like Rushmore and Bottle Rocket worked for me because there was this balance of this postmodern movie mixtape type of style with genuine humanity. But now his style has become bigger than him to the point where his films feel like caricatures of themselves, where it just feels like he throws any actor he can into these twee exercises in empty smoke and mirrors and accoutrements. It's like, I get it. The framing is super symmetrical. Oh my God, that actor said something with no emotion. Isn't that ironic? Shit is played out, and I think it's affected American indie filmmaking for the worst. Ooh. Fantastic. Thank you so much for saying all of that, because yeah, that is, I think, a hot take. A lot of Wes Anderson fans. I have a lot of friends who are huge Wes Anderson fans. I notice a lot of people that maybe aren't necessarily into movies or not necessarily into like art house stuff tend to really like Wes Anderson, and that's really cool. I don't agree with you in this sense. Like I like Wes Anderson a lot, and I don't think that his later works are completely cold and completely lost. I think they're amazing pieces of work, and like Paul Thomas Anderson, the aesthetic and the commitment to the style and the choreography and just all of that is really, really, really amazing. But yeah, I totally get it. It's so common. We see it all the time, like especially some auteur director, especially like an auteur American director, starts out making movies with lower budgets, and they're more soulful, more from the heart. And then they get bigger budgets and all that, and they feel as though they got to make more like topical films that are more political or social, whatever. They have something important attached to them, or they feel the weight of their significance, and that's fine. And like, I think there's some amazing films like that. Like Grand Budapest Hotel, I really think is an amazing film. I think it's quite an achievement, but it does at the same time totally suffer from, I think, what you're saying here, where his style became bigger than him to the point where I do feel very removed from the characters and very removed from all the things that are going on, to the point that when The French Dispatch came out, I wasn't that interested in seeing it. And I admit I still haven't seen it. And it's probably a terrible thing to admit, but here we are. When it comes to maybe the last like 10, 12 years, for me, the best Wes Anderson movie by far was Moonrise Kingdom. And I think it is because it created that perfect balance. It had such an emotional potency to it, and yet it's still very sharp and very much Wes Anderson. But yeah, I think certain styles are just, they're really going to work for certain people and then maybe not so much for other people, especially really, really pointed, accented styles like this one. For me, as I said, I really appreciated it, but it's not necessarily for me in the way that maybe other film director styles I really gravitate towards. Robert Zemeckis movies generally feel soulless and gimmicky to me. Who Framed Roger Rabbit and Back to the Future are good, and Contact is all right, I guess, but all of his other films are either unnecessarily sappy or thoroughly uninteresting. He often gets praised for using cutting-edge visual effects to strengthen his characters and stories, but I don't see it. Yeah, I think a lot of people say that. Zemeckis is often the butt of jokes, and quite literally. What was that Kaufman movie? I'm thinking of Ending Things, where like they even made a joke about Robert Zemeckis in the movie, and I was like, wow, that's quite quite interesting. I'll actually give him credit. I find myself defending Zemeckis weirdly, even though, I am one of those people who does not like Forrest Gump, and I'm not really into a lot of his movies, but I do think that he is a very good filmmaker, and often because his movies are so blotchy and so uneven and so muddled, we kind of forget that. But there are some amazing set pieces and sequences in his movies. I really like the movie Flight. Is it a mess of a movie? Absolutely, but it has some very good things in it. First of all, Denzel's amazing in it. The premise, like the story and just like the weight of all those morals, I think is very, very interesting. The flight sequence at the beginning is really, really good. So yeah, like that's an example of like he's got more going for him than you think he does. And then, you know, like I look at a movie like Contact, a movie that is so stupid, like just yeah, it's really, really dumb. And yet I still revisit so many of those like space sequences just because they're so tense and so like they're properly cinematic in the ways that we just don't see anymore. But unfortunately, it's the cartoonishness of the movies and combined with more that like social realism he's always going for, it just doesn't work for me. But yeah, Roger Rabbit and Back to the Future are his most balanced works, but I think it's because, you know, they are more pulpy, they are more cartoony by nature. And yeah, when it comes to the visual effects, that is something I think he is that is overrated about him, because I always feel like it was a bit of a distraction a lot of the time, especially when you get to the stuff like Polar Express and all that. None of that is working. He went way too deep into it. But I think it's another case of a director just really kind of feeling in their element earlier in their career, not quite finding their footing once they get all the accolades and the success. And the last one, Luca Guadagnino. The writing is often neglected to what seems like an over-prioritization of an overall aesthetic or aesthetic choices. Specifically, major plot points are often underdeveloped, moreover don't exist, which led to a razor-thin narrative or even lack of performance level extracted out of the cast. There's a feeling that every film had much more potential than was shown or possibly intended. Well, we all know my opinions on Luca Guadagnino, so you are saying everything that I want to hear. And I know a lot of people really hate my opinions on Guadagnino, and that's fine. Yeah, pretty much everything you're saying here, I completely 100% agree with. With Guadagnino films, after the fact, sometimes maybe an image will stick with me, but it's almost never connected to anything. And I always get the sense when I watch his movies, it's like he'd probably be like a great director of like commercials, like fashion photography and stuff like that in Italy. I'm sure he's amazing at it. I bet he's one of those people where I could go to his house and it's like brilliantly decorated and he probably has the most amazing like music collection and art collection and all of that. And yet it's never quite coming together just as a director. He cannot bring the emotion and the stories and the characters all together and the aesthetic where, you know, it's working harmoniously. It's another example of somebody feeling very blotchy for me. I look at a movie like Suspiria, the remake of that film, or, you know, the original, and, you know, my review for that, a lot of people disagreed with me, and that's fine, but I stand by it. I don't like the Guadagnino version because it suffers from so many of things that a lot of modern movies today suffer from. It just kind of, it gets so lost, it gets so muddled. It's lost in like all the politics and all of this, like, you know, the explanation of what the witches are and the feminism. It's like, it's trying to be too meaningful, and it just kind of drains all the poetry and all the tension out of everything. And it's like, it's very muted and very minimalist to the point where it's incredibly sterile. So it's like, I don't feel the body horror. I don't feel the kind of the surrealism, the madness of all this stuff. So that's a perfect example because yeah, the costumes were amazing and like some of the dance sequences, it's like I can sense like what taste is going on here. And yet just from a filmmaking perspective, I didn't feel any of it. I didn't feel the flesh. I didn't feel any sort of tension. And that is a huge problem for me. And when I saw Call Me By Your Name, that's when I realized it's like, okay, I was hoping that because that movie is a lot more kind of small and more intimate and it's meant to be slower and everything, it's like, okay, he can't do all of those flourishes that he normally uses. He can't kind of disguise with all the smoke and mirrors. He's going to have to focus on the characters and focus on the emotion. And yet, I don't know, it just didn't work for me. I know I'm like one of the only people. I know everybody loves that movie, and I found it to be so dull, and I didn't find any emotion in it. I didn't see any chemistry between the Chalamet character and the Armie Hammer character. So yeah, I don't know, it just felt incredibly empty for me. Yeah, there are people that love him, and hey, maybe you can explain to me what I'm missing, and maybe I can revisit some of his works with that in mind. But yeah, so those are a few of the ones that you guys chose. Again, I really enjoy doing these kinds of conversations, so we'll probably do another one at some point. But thank you guys so much for watching the video. I'm going to plug my website as always. It is deepfocuslens.com. I'm an artist. I do commissioned portraits, and I also sell prints of my work. If that is something that you're interested in, you can always go to the website below. And if you have a question about a commission or a print, you can always email me. My email is in the description box below as well. Also, I'd like to give a shout out to my patrons who are wonderful guys. Thank you so much for your support, and if you are interested in supporting, the link for that is below, as well as the rest of my social media information. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.